Without warning, they appeared one day in the east, an unknown tribe from an unknown land. Masters of the horse and the bow, they struck as swiftly as an arrow, robbing, burning, killing, passing over the land like locusts. In the 5th century AD, they swept across the plains of Europe to the gates of Rome itself, the horsemen of the apocalypse. For 100 years, the rumble of hooves in the distance heralded the arrival of Hun horsemen. Where they came from or why, no one knew. They rode out of the steppes of Central Asia, but to the Christians of Europe, they seemed to materialize as if ghosts.
They're without fixed abode, without hearth or law or settled mode of life, and keep roaming from place to place like fugitives.
They were warrior nomads, roaming with their herds and flocks. Exactly why they left their homeland to the north of the Sea of Azov is uncertain. One explanation is that they were drawn to the mild climate and fertile soil of southern Russia. Shortly after the year 370 AD, they began their assault on the rich Ostrogothic kingdom that stretched from the Don to the Dniester and from the Black Sea to the Pripyat marshes. Living on horseback and out of their wagons, they traveled in bands of a few hundred strong, grazed the land and passed on. If they spied an enemy, they would dash in, strike, then flee, only to reappear elsewhere and strike again. If attacked, they could build a fort in an instant by circling their wagons. Before long, reports had reached the Roman garrisons on the Danube that unusually large movements had begun among the northern barbarians. A savage people of great ferocity had struck the Gothic tribes with terror and sent them fleeing from their homes. Whenever Hun met Goth, the outcome was the same. A hail of arrows would rain down on the Goths before they could get to grips with their attackers.
They were everywhere before they were least expected, for by their speed they outstripped the rumor of their approach. They spared neither religion, rank, nor age. They showed no pity to the cry of infancy.
Armed only with spears and swords, the Goths were forced to charge. The Huns would fall back as though in flight, but when their pursuers were nearing exhaustion, they would suddenly wheel their horses and strike.
A race of men hitherto unknown had arisen from a hidden nook of the earth, like a tempest of snows from the high mountains, and was seizing or destroying everything in its way.
As bands of Goths began to cross the Danube, the Romans were forced to conclude that the reports of a new barbarian horde approaching from the east were true.
Every day unrest, every day new reports of misfortunes, every day new blows, nothing but fights. The east has been carried away into captivity, and nobody lives in the destroyed cities.
They made nothing, built nothing, left nothing behind. No monuments, no chronicles, only desolation. But in the records of their enemies, the deeds of one ordinary warrior who accomplished extraordinary feats survive. His name was Edico.
Having effected the greatest deeds in war, he was excellent in military affairs.
Without their prowess as horsemen, the Huns would never have made such an indelible mark on history. Young Edico went straight from the cradle to the saddle.
Scarce has the infant learnt to stand without his mother's aid when a horse takes him on his back. You would think that the limbs of man and horse were born together, so firmly does the rider always stick to the horse. Any other folk is carried on horseback. This folk live there.
So attached to their horses did the Huns seem that some enemies believed that they could not walk.
By night and day, every one of that nation buys and sells, eats and drinks from their horses, and bowed over the narrow neck of the animal, relaxes into a deep, dream-filled sleep.
Their small, long-haired ponies were a rugged breed, well adapted to heat and cold, and long hours of toil. In art, the Huns celebrated the horse along with the livestock that sustained them. The horse was transport, sustenance, currency. It could be bartered for goods, for the Huns did not farm. They traded with the booty of war. At 3, young Edico had learned to ride. At 5, he had learned to hunt with a bow. At so young an age, he was marked with a look that would frighten his enemies.
They cut the cheeks of the males with a sword, so that they are compelled to learn to endure a wound.
Edico learned not only to endure wounds, but to inflict them. No weapon could match his own, the short Hunnic bow. It was a reflex design that, when strung, bent back upon itself to produce a tension unmatched by any bow of that time. A Hun could fire an arrow more than 220 meters. No other archer could send his arrows so far, so fast. The bow gained its power from both its reverse curve and its layers of material. The core, usually of birch, would be shaped and seasoned until it gradually acquired 2 curves. Animal sinew was then glued to one side. Pieces of horn, carefully cut, lined the other. Sections of bone gave the bow yet more strength. Reinforced with so many layers, the bow could be drawn farther than any other without breaking. It took weeks to make, as the bowyer waited for the wood to season and the glue to dry. If it was broken, its strength could never be restored. A marksman on horseback, the Hun was untouchable, unbeatable. Romans believed that the Huns were devils, sent as retribution for the sins of the world. No devil was more feared than the one called Attila. In 434 AD, Attila succeeded his uncle Rua as leader of the last and greatest of the Hun confederacies. His huge domain, ruled jointly with his brother Bleda, stretched from the Rhine to the Baltic and included the plains of the land now known as Hungary. But the Huns could not settle down. Attila's unruly subjects craved gold to buy wheat, metal to forge into weapons, pastures to graze their herds. Their allegiance could be bought, but only with unending plunder. For the Huns, life was a cycle of war. In 441, Attila set his gaze on a rich prize, the Eastern Roman Empire, ruled from the great city of Constantinople. Using the robbing of royal Hun graves as a pretext, he sent his horsemen south across the Danube. Edico was among the warriors who blazed a path of destruction. Belgrade was razed, then Nice, then Sofia. The Huns campaigned not to occupy, but to plunder and destroy. Ahead, people fled at their approach. Behind, few were left alive to pursue them. For Edico, it was a glorious campaign. Proving himself in battle again and again, he was made bodyguard and advisor to Attila. With the Eastern Empire denuded of troops, busy fighting the Vandals in Sicily, there was no obstacle to impede the relentless advance of the Huns. Not even nature could slow them. In their wagons, the Huns carried pontoons to span marshes and rafts to cross rivers. When the Roman army did return, it was destroyed in a series of battles outside the capital. The harsh peace terms included the payment of 900 kilos of gold a year in tribute. In 447 AD, Attila's army invaded the Eastern Empire for a second time. This time, the attack was carried out not only by Huns, but by contingents of their subject races as well. By late spring, the Huns were once again threatening the opulent city of Constantinople. Theodosius, the Eastern Emperor, sent out the legions that were left to him. Near the river Vid in Thrace, the imperial army was attacked by the Huns and their allies.
They enter the battle in formation, while their medley of voices makes a savage noise. And as they are lightly equipped for swift motion and unexpected in action, they purposely divide suddenly in scattered bands and attack, rushing about in disorder here and there, dealing terrific slaughter.
Into the broken ranks of the Romans, Edico led a charge. At close quarters, the Huns wielded swords and another revolutionary weapon, the lasso. Skilled at using it to catch horses and cattle, now it was employed to snare men. By nightfall, the ground was littered with Roman corpses, although the Hun losses were also severe. When Marcianople, the largest city in Thrace, fell soon after the battle, Theodosius had no option but to sue for peace.
The Huns surpassed in their greatness all the forces of the Romans. They were the masters, and the Romans the slaves.
Having laid waste to the Eastern Empire's Balkan provinces, the shrewd Attila conscripted the ablest of his captives, such as engineers, into his own army. The rest was sold or enslaved. Then he sent Edico to Constantinople to conduct the peace negotiations. As well as yet more tribute, Attila demanded that the Romans evacuate a wide belt of country south of the Danube. It was 500 kilometers wide and 200 deep. Theodosius had no option but to agree. One year later, Edico returned to Constantinople with a letter from Attila threatening to renew war unless the Romans speeded up the evacuation of the land south of the Danube. Theodosius's chief minister, the eunuch Chrysotheus, countered by offering Edico untold riches if he would murder Attila. Edico pretended to accept the offer on condition that he be given 100 kilos of gold to ensure the allegiance of certain prominent Huns. Then, on returning, he reported the plot to his master. But Attila had already decided to invade the unprepared lands to the west and was content to conclude yet another treaty. In 451, the Huns crossed the Rhine and stormed into the part of Gaul now known as eastern France. Riding unopposed, they scorched the land and put hundreds to the sword. But the Western Romans were far from idle. They were busy persuading their former enemies, the Visigoths, to join forces with them against Attila. At last, in June, the combined army under the command of the Roman Aetius met the Huns near Troy in Champagne. Wearing an iron helmet and elaborate leather armor, Edico took his place among the Hun elite. Around him, his comrades displayed the wealth of nearly a century of victory, weapons and equipment stripped from the vanquished. Alongside their cavalry, the Huns now deployed foot soldiers, drawn from the German and Ostrogoth tribes they had conquered. Edico saw the armies were well matched, and not only in numbers. After years of defeat, the Romans had learned from the barbarians, occasionally employing them as mercenaries. They had copied their tactics and their bows. On the eve of battle, Attila made a sacrifice. He peered at the streaks in the bones and sought omens for battle. He did not like what he saw. Thousands of Huns would die. Early next morning, as they were preparing for battle, the Romans were deafened by howls that seemed to come from thousands of animals. Then lightning struck.
Hand to hand, they clashed in battle. The fight grew fierce, confused, monstrous, unrelenting, a fight the like of which no ancient time has ever recorded. There such deeds were done that a brave man who missed this marvelous spectacle could not hope to see anything so wonderful all his life long.
battle raged to and fro. For the first time, the Huns met an army that would not flee. Despite the death of Theodoric, the Visigoth king, the Roman-led force eventually managed to drive the Huns off a large hill which dominated the battlefield. By nightfall, they had retreated into their circle of wagons to the rear. Thousands remained on the fields where they had fallen. The omens foretold the night before were true. Mindful that the total destruction of the Huns would leave the Western Empire vulnerable to attack by the Goths, Aetius allowed Attila to slip away to the east. It was a mistake. A year later, he invaded northern Italy and left a trail of devastation. But it was his last campaign. He died in 453. Inconsolable, the Huns cut their hair and slashed their faces so that the greatest of all warriors should be mourned not with female lamentations, but with the blood of men. Without Attila, the empire collapsed. His generals warred among themselves. His Germanic subjects rebelled. In 470 AD, Edico died, as Attila should have, in battle. Within a generation, the sound of wild ponies and wilder men faded away. The Huns diluted their blood by intermarrying with tamer tribes. Just over 100 years after their first dramatic appearance, the Huns had vanished, leaving few traces of their passage through Europe or history. Edico's legacy was more enduring than the great Attila's. In 476 AD, Romulus, the last Roman emperor in the West, was deposed. His place was taken by a barbarian, one of his own generals, a warrior named Odoacer, son of Edico the Hun.